The sound of children's laughter once filled the streets of Norwood Park, a quiet Chicago suburb where families felt safe and neighbors waved across their lawns. Among them lived a man everyone seemed to trust, a man who threw parties, volunteered for community events, and dressed as a clown to entertain sick children. His name was John Wayne Gacy, and to those who knew him, he was a friendly contractor, the smiling face behind the grease paint. No one could have guessed that beneath that mask lay one of the darkest souls in American history. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. From the outside, his early years looked ordinary, even uneventful. But behind closed doors, his home was a place of fear. His father, an alcoholic and World War I veteran, had a violent temper. He often belittled young John, calling him names and accusing him of being weak. His mother tried to protect him, but Gacy grew up feeling humiliated and small, desperate for approval he would never receive. Those wounds, carved deep in childhood, festered silently in his mind. Despite the abuse, Gacy tried to lead what others would consider a normal life. As a teenager, he was active in his local church and even dreamed of a stable future. He briefly left home, working odd jobs and trying to find purpose. In his early 20s, he moved to Las Vegas and found work in a mortuary. There, he spent long nights alone with the dead, an experience that some say left a permanent imprint on his psyche. Later, he returned to Illinois, studied business, and appeared to settle down. By 1964, Gacy had married Marlyn Myers, a woman from a respectable family, and together they moved to Waterloo, Iowa. There, Gacy managed 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. To everyone around him, he was a rising success story, charming, ambitious, and generous. He joined the local JCs, a civic group, where he was admired for his enthusiasm and leadership. Yet even then, his double life had begun. Behind the polished smile and social charm, he was already preying on teenage boys, luring them with alcohol, attention, and promises of easy money. In 1968, his hidden world came crashing down. He was arrested and convicted for sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy. The court sentenced him to 10 years in prison, but good behavior and manipulation earned him early release, after serving only 18 months. His wife divorced him while he was behind bars, and his father died during his imprisonment, leaving him with deep resentment and humiliation. When Gacy walked out of prison in 1970, he swore to rebuild his life and to make sure no one ever saw the monster again. He returned to Chicago, reinventing himself as a small business owner and contractor. He founded PDM Contractors, hiring young men to help with construction jobs, the very type of victims he would later target. He bought a modest house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet neighborhood where families trusted one another. To his new neighbors, Gacy seemed like the perfect citizen, hardworking, friendly, always ready to lend a hand. He threw elaborate backyard barbecues, hosted political fundraisers, and volunteered as a clown for children's parties. He even joined local Democratic campaigns and had photos with city officials, including First Lady Rosalind Carter. No one suspected that beneath his cheerful exterior, the same rage and deviance that once sent him to prison were stirring again. By the early 1970s, Gacy had perfected his act. As Pogo the Clown, he performed at parades, hospitals, and birthday parties, painting a wide red smile across his face, a smile that would later haunt the nation. But the clown persona was more than just entertainment. It was a disguise, a way for him to hide the darkness growing inside. His house became a place of secrets, a place where laughter from parties would one day be replaced by the stench of death. No one knew it yet, but as Gacy painted his clown face and entertained the neighborhood, the foundations of one of America's most horrifying crime stories were already being laid. Beneath that suburban home, in a narrow crawl space, lay the future graves of dozens of young men and boys who would vanish without a trace. John Wayne Gacy lived 2 lives, one that the world could see and one that it couldn't. The first was built on smiles, community service, and political ambition. The second was built on lies, cruelty, and an insatiable need to dominate and destroy. It was only a matter of time before the mask would slip, and the monster underneath would finally reveal himself. By the early 1970s, John Wayne Gacy had mastered the art of deception to the world. He was a helpful contractor, the cheerful clown, the man who gave second chances to troubled boys who needed work. But to the young men and boys who entered his home on 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, it was the last place they would ever see. It began quietly, without warning, a pattern that would repeat itself dozens of times. The first known victim was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old boy who met Gacy at a Chicago bus station in 1972. McCoy was kind, polite, and trusting. Gacy offered him a warm meal and a place to stay for the night. By morning, Timothy was dead, stabbed to death in what Gacy would later describe as self-defense, though there was no sign of struggle. Afterward, he buried McCoy's body in the crawl space beneath his home, the first of many graves that would soon fill the dark soil below. That night awakened something in John Wayne Gacy, something monstrous and uncontrollable. Killing gave him a rush, a sense of power he had never known. And once he crossed that line, he never turned back. Over the next 6 years, Gacy lured young men from bus stations, streets, and parties, most of them runaways, drifters, or teenage boys looking for work. He promised them construction jobs, easy money, or simply a place to crash. Some he even knew personally, employees from his contracting company. He would gain their trust, invite them into his home, and offer them drinks or marijuana. Then his tone would change. Gacy's method was chillingly consistent. He would show his victims a pair of handcuffs, claiming he wanted to perform a magic trick. He demonstrated how to escape from them, then convinced his victims to try. But once the handcuffs clicked shut, the trick was over. What followed was torture, humiliation, and slow death. Gacy often strangled his victims with a rope, tightening it around their necks using a makeshift tourniquet fashioned from a stick. He called it his rope trick. When the struggling stopped, Gacy would bury the bodies in the crawl space beneath his home. Crawling on his hands and knees, he dug shallow graves in the damp earth. The smell of decay grew worse with time, but he covered it with quicklime and lies, telling visitors it was just a plumbing problem. When the crawl space filled, he began disposing of bodies in the nearby Des Plaines River. Neighbors occasionally noticed strange things, a foul odor seeping from his home, young men going in but never coming out. But Gacy was charming, confident, and politically connected. He brushed off suspicion with ease. He was known in town as the man who threw big parties, wore bright clown makeup, and knew all the local politicians. Who would suspect him of being a murderer? By 1975, Gacy's cruelty had escalated. Among his victims that year was John Butkovich, a 17-year-old employee who had gone to Gacy's house to ask about unpaid wages. He vanished without a trace. His car was later found abandoned, keys and wallet still inside, but no one could link Gacy to the disappearance. Over the years, parents filed missing person reports, but police rarely connected the dots. Many of the victims were teenagers from difficult homes or young men estranged from their families. In Gacy's words, they were the ones no one would miss. By 1978, Gacy's double life was in full swing. By day, he worked on construction projects, laughed with neighbors, and attended community meetings. By night, his house became a chamber of horror. Sometimes he even wore his clown costume after killing, performing as pogo for children's events while the remains of his victims decomposed just feet beneath his floor. Inside that modest Chicago home, beneath the cheerful facade, was a world of unspeakable darkness. As the years passed, the number of victims grew, 33 young men and boys in total. Some of their names would never be known, their faces never identified. Others would later be recognized through painstaking forensic work and dental records. Gacy's victims were sons, brothers, and friends, boys full of dreams and potential. Some wanted to start families. Others wanted to build careers. They trusted a man who looked like a friend, who promised safety and opportunity. What they found instead was terror beyond comprehension. For 6 years, Gacy's crimes went unnoticed, hidden beneath the laughter of a friendly clown and the polite smile of a suburban neighbor. But monsters can only hide for so long. The walls were beginning to close in. The smell from beneath his home grew unbearable. Rumors spread. And when one teenage boy vanished after meeting Gacy, a boy whose family refused to give up, the mask finally began to crack. It was December 1978, the winter that finally unraveled the illusion John Wayne Gacy had built. For 6 long years, he had lived as a man of the community, hosting barbecues, dressing up as Pogo the Clown, shaking hands with politicians, and even volunteering for charity events. But beneath the smiling mask was a predator, one whose secret graveyard was beginning to betray him. The final threat of his downfall began with the disappearance of Robert Piest, a bright and ambitious 15-year-old boy. Robert worked part-time at a local pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. On the night of December 11, 1978, he told a co-worker he was going to speak with a contractor who was offering him a job that paid well, a man named John Gacy. He promised he'd be right back. But Robert never returned. When Robert's mother came to pick him up, she waited in the parking lot, headlights cutting through the winter darkness. Minutes turned into hours. Her son never appeared. Panic set in. She knew her boy. He was responsible, kind, and never would have run off without telling her. That night, she reported him missing. The next day, Detective Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department took on the case. At first, Gacy seemed cooperative, polite, even jovial. He claimed he never met Robert, that he'd been too busy attending a wake that evening. But something in Gacy's story didn't add up. The detective noticed inconsistencies, small but telling. And when Gacy's criminal record revealed a prior conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage boy years earlier, Kozenzak's instincts sharpened. Something was very wrong. Police soon obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house. When they entered his home on December 13th, 1978, they weren't prepared for what they would find, or what they would smell. A foul, unmistakable odor drifted up from the crawl space. Gacy dismissed it as a moisture problem. The officers noted the stench, but lacked enough evidence to dig further. Still, they took a few suspicious items. A photo ID belonging to another missing boy, handcuffs, a box of driver's licenses, and a few other small clues. Individually, they proved nothing, but together, they painted a sinister picture. Over the next week, Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was being followed and watched by police, and he knew it. Sometimes he invited detectives for breakfast. Other times, he went on wild drinking binges, muttering incoherently about his life falling apart. His once charming facade began to crumble. On December 19, investigators discovered that Gacy's employees and acquaintances had also vanished over the years. Names like John Butkovich, Gregory Godzik, and others started surfacing. Young men who had last been seen alive with Gacy. The coincidences were too many to ignore. Surveillance intensified. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. 2 days later, one of Gacy's employees, David Cram, came forward with a horrifying story. He told detectives that Gacy had once handcuffed him as a joke and threatened him. Cram had escaped, barely. His testimony echoed a pattern, matching what investigators suspected had happened to other missing boys. The walls were closing in, and Gacy could feel it. On December 20th, 1978, in a moment of sheer desperation, he drove to his lawyer's office, reeking of alcohol and sweat, and confessed, "I've been a bad person. I've killed 30 people, maybe more." The lawyer, stunned and terrified, listened as Gacy rambled incoherently about young men buried under his house. Then, before the lawyer could alert police, Gacy stumbled out and disappeared into the night. Later that evening, Gacy's car was spotted. Police moved in and arrested him. As they drove him away, snow was falling over Chicago, quiet, cold, and heavy, as if trying to cover the horrors buried beneath the ground. A second search warrant was issued that same night. Detectives entered Gacy's home once more, armed with shovels and flashlights. They descended into the crawl space, a narrow, suffocating area just 2 feet high. What they found would haunt them forever. Beneath the dirt floor lay human bones, dozens of them. The unmistakable smell of death filled the air. As they dug deeper, more remains surfaced. 1, then 2, then several more. Within hours, the truth was undeniable. John Wayne Gacy's house was a mass grave. Over the following days, investigators uncovered 29 bodies buried beneath his home and garage. For others were later found in the nearby Des Plaines River. Each one told a story of unimaginable suffering and betrayal. When confronted with the evidence, Gacy's mask finally fell. When John Wayne Gacy was finally arrested, the world struggled to comprehend the enormity of his crimes. The smiling clown, the neighbor who threw summer cookouts, the man who worked with politicians, performed for children, and shook hands with police officers, was now revealed as a monster who had taken 33 innocent lives. The news broke like a tidal wave. Reporters from across the country flooded into Chicago. Headlines screamed words like House of Horrors and The Killer Clown. People wanted answers. How could a man who looked so normal, so kind, hide so much darkness? As Gacy awaited trial, he was eerily calm. In interviews, he denied many of the killings, blaming multiple personalities and claiming others had committed some of the murders. "I'm not the monster they make me out to be," he said, his face expressionless. "There were things I didn't do." But investigators had mountains of evidence. The bodies beneath his home, the IDs, the clothing, the witnesses, the confessions. Every detail pointed back to him. In February 1980, after years of investigation and psychological evaluation, the trial of John Wayne Gacy began. It was one of the most sensational trials in U.S. history. The courtroom was packed every day. Journalists, survivors' families, curious onlookers, even psychologists. Everyone wanted to witness the man who had become the embodiment of evil. The defense tried to argue insanity. They claimed that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder, that when he killed, it wasn't really him, it was another part of his mind. His lawyers described Gacy as a man split between personas: the responsible businessman, the civic volunteer, and the murderous alter ego who took over in moments of madness. But the prosecution was relentless. They presented evidence showing Gacy's crimes were meticulously planned. He bought handcuffs, dug graves in advance, poured lime over decomposing bodies, and even stopped killing temporarily when his crawl space was full. This wasn't insanity. It was organization. It was control. It was evil, calculated and deliberate. Throughout the trial, witnesses testified. Parents who had lost their sons, workers who had helped dig trenches in Gacy's crawl space without realizing they were digging graves, young men who had narrowly escaped his grip. The jury sat frozen, many unable to look at the graphic photos of remains pulled from under the house. Psychologists who examined Gacy described him as a psychopath, intelligent, manipulative, devoid of empathy. He could mimic human emotion, but didn't feel it. One psychiatrist said, "John Wayne Gacy doesn't see people as people. He sees them as things, objects to use, to control, to dispose of." When Gacy took the stand, his arrogance was chilling. He smiled, cracked jokes, and even taunted the prosecutors. At one point, he claimed that he only buried bodies, not killed them, and that some of the victims had died by accident. It was as if he couldn't fully grasp the gravity of his actions, or refused to. To him, it was all a game. After weeks of testimony, the jury took just 2 hours to deliberate. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the worst serial killing sprees in U.S. history. The verdict was unanimous: death by lethal injection. When the sentence was read, Gacy showed no emotion. He turned to his lawyers and said calmly, "Well, they're killing me for burying 30 bodies. I could have done worse." He was sent to Menard Correctional Center, where he would spend the next 14 years on death row. Even behind bars, Gacy continued to manipulate attention. He gave interviews, painted portraits of clowns, and complained about unfair treatment. Some of his paintings sold for thousands of dollars, purchased by collectors drawn to macabre. In his mind, he was still in control, still the center of the story. But as psychologists studied him, a clearer picture emerged. Gacy fit the classic profile of an organized sexual sadist, someone who derived pleasure from dominance and control. His clown persona, Pogo, wasn't just a costume. It was a symbol of his dual life: cheerful on the outside, monstrous within. Experts suggested his violent urges stemmed from childhood abuse, humiliation, and sexual repression. He had been beaten by his father, bullied as a boy, and struggled with his own sexuality, all of which may have fed into a compulsion to assert power over vulnerable young men. Yet many agreed Gacy's actions were far beyond explanation. He wasn't merely broken. He was monstrous and fully aware of it. As years passed, appeals failed. Families of victims continued to seek closure, some attending hearings, others refusing to ever speak Gacy's name again. To them, justice couldn't come soon enough. On May 10, 1994, after 14 years of appeals and delays, John Wayne Gacy was finally executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. At 12:58 a.m., the man who had haunted Chicago for years was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, hundreds gathered, some cheering, others holding candles for the victims. For the families, it was not triumph, but release. The killer clown was gone, but his shadow, the horror of what he had done, would never fade. When John Wayne Gacy took his final breath in May 1994, many believe it marked the end of a nightmare, the closing of one of America's darkest chapters. But death did not bury his shadow. The horror he left behind continued to ripple through Chicago and far beyond, reshaping how society viewed evil, trust, and the monsters hiding behind masks of normality. In the weeks following his execution, Gacy's name dominated headlines once more. The public's fascination didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. People wanted to understand how such darkness could live behind such an ordinary face. He had lived among families, attended church events, and even entertained children. His duality, laughter by day, murder by night, was too chilling to forget. The families of his victims carried the deepest scars. For them, justice had come too late. Many had spent years not knowing what happened to their sons, brothers, or friends. Some of the remains found beneath Gacy's house were so decomposed that identification took decades. Even today, 5 of the 33 victims remain unidentified, their names lost, but their stories forever tied to the house on Somerdale Avenue. For those who finally got answers, closure was bittersweet. Parents described the unbearable grief of hearing that their child's body had been pulled from the ground beneath Gacy's home. It was like losing him twice, one mother said. Once when he disappeared, and again when I learned where he was found. Their lives became marked by a kind of sorrow that never truly ends, the kind that lingers in every photo, every memory, every what-if. The community of Norwood Park, where Gacy's house once stood, changed forever. The property was demolished in 1979, leaving only an empty lot, a scar in the neighborhood. Grass eventually grew over the dirt where the crawl space had been. But for those who lived nearby, the ground never felt clean again. People avoided the street, whisper when they passed, and for decades, no one wanted to live there. Evil had lived too close. In the years after Gacy's arrest, the case became a defining example in criminal psychology and forensic science. His meticulous burial of bodies led investigators to improve techniques for excavation and identification. The use of dental records and DNA analysis in the Gacy case became a model for solving future serial crimes. Experts studied his personality to better understand psychopathy, how individuals like Gacy could blend into society, mimic empathy, and manipulate trust. He became a textbook example in criminology courses around the world, the predator who looked like a friend. But the legacy of John Wayne Gacy reached even deeper into American culture. He became a symbol of the hidden monster, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a terrifying face. Sometimes it wears a smile, a suit, or even a clown's paint. His crimes inspired countless documentaries, books, and films, from psychological studies to horror adaptations. Yet for many, these retellings weren't just entertainment. They were warnings. Parents grew more cautious. Strangers became less trusted. The idea that someone so seemingly ordinary could be capable of such depravity changed the collective sense of safety in America. It marked the end of an age of innocence and the beginning of a new era of fear and vigilance. In prison, before his death, Gacy once said, "Everybody has killers in them. It's just a matter of degree." He believed his acts were misunderstood, that he was a product of society's failures. But the truth was simpler and more horrifying. John Wayne Gacy chose to kill. Again and again, without remorse. Even decades later, his crimes continue to echo. Investigators still work to identify his remaining unknown victims using modern DNA technology. Each discovery brings another family closer to the truth, another ghost given a name. Yet the story of Gacy is not just about him. It's about the victims, the families, and the enduring human struggle to comprehend how one man could hold so much darkness. And perhaps that's the real horror. Not just the killings, but the reminder that monsters can live next door, that they can laugh and wave and seem utterly harmless, that beneath the face paint and the charm, they can hide the unimaginable. As we remember the victims, the boys who trusted, the young men who never came home, we are reminded that evil rarely looks evil at first glance. And though Gacy's house is gone, though his laughter is long faded, the question he leaves behind still chills the soul. How many more monsters walk among us, wearing smiles instead of masks,